Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to do an in-depth review of the Retroid Pocket 5. Now last week I did an impressions video, and that one got a little bit out of hand. I think it was 37 minutes long in the end. And in that video I went into detail about things like the screen and the size and the weight and the buttons, so we're not going to go over too much of that stuff in this video. Instead we're going to do a deep dive into my past week with this handheld and whether or not I recommend it. And to give you an idea right up front, yes, this is one that is very easy to recommend. In fact, if you're looking for a handheld under about $250, this is definitely the one to get. However, there is some competition, especially at that higher price point around $300, so we'll talk about that as well. And I'm expecting this to be a pretty long one too, so grab a snack and drink and let's get started. Okay, we're going to start this review with a fundamental question, and that is, what is the Retroid Pocket 5? We're going to ask that question again near the end of the video. Now, at the very basic level, the Retroid Pocket 5 is simply an Android-based device that has built-in controls. And so essentially, the experience is going to be very similar to taking an Android phone or tablet and turning it into a gaming machine. And as a quick recap of the specs, the processor here is the Snapdragon 865. And that's a fairly beefy CPU that will work with most emulated systems. We'll test the performance in this video. It also comes with 8 GB of RAM, which I found to be sufficient for most of my gaming needs. Now, by far my favorite thing about this device is the display. It is 5.5 inches, 1080p, and it's AMOLED. And as you'll see throughout this video, it is absolutely gorgeous. And the last few specs are going to be that it is Android 13, it has Wi-Fi 6, and also a 5,000 mAh battery. And in terms of pricing, it is $220 before taxes and shipping, which generally will make it, somewhere under $250. Now, one question I've gotten a lot over the past week is whether or not these devices come preloaded with a bunch of games. And to clarify, these do not. They do come with some emulators that you can pre-install, but honestly, I think you're better off just installing your own. I've also got a Retroid Pocket starter guide, which I'll leave linked down below, which will help you get started on your way if this is your first time trying out one of these devices. Now let's talk a little bit about those colors. Like I mentioned before, there are 4 different options, and I happen to have 2 of them right here. In my impressions video, I only had the 16-bit model to test, but then Retroid rushed over the black model because I had a couple things I wanted to test with it. So let's talk about the 2 colors that I have and what I wanted to test with them, and it has to do with the black model and the screen. Because these devices have an all-glass front and what is essentially a hidden bezel and an OLED display, that means that the black bars on the left and right when playing something that's not 16:9 are essentially going to blend into the rest of the device on that black model. And so that's what I wanted to test, and sure enough, as you can see from this example here, it feels like when I'm playing Chrono Trigger, it's a little bit more immersive with the black model than the tan one. And so I would say that yes, my idea here that this would be a little bit better suited to just make it a more immersive experience does stand. Now, in fairness, depending on your lighting condition, you will probably still see the AMOLED display, so it's not a perfect blend, but it's still very close. And I think most people will not be playing in like a studio environment or under direct sunlight, and so in those cases, it really is going to blend in. On the other hand, with the 16-bit model up above, you can obviously see that we have black bars on the left and right. I think that both images look gorgeous on this AMOLED display, but I do think that the black model is just a little bit more immersive. Now that being said, having a black model as well as a full glass front does present its own problems. The first is that the black model is exceptionally reflective. Again, this really only comes into play when you're in a well-lit environment like next to a window, but it does get pretty distracting. Thankfully, the screen is so bright that it's not one of those things that takes away from the screen experience, but it is something to be mindful of. Another thing to keep in mind is because we have an all-glass front, that means that you will see smudging, especially on the black model. And again, this is a little bit exacerbated because we are under studio lights, but you can see here that it is very apparent. When under just regular lighting conditions, like when playing at my house, I don't really notice it at all. But you can see with the 16-bit model, even under direct studio lights, it's still very hard to see any smudging. Thankfully, one of the nice things about the plastics in the Retroid Pocket 5 is they seem to be very smudge resistant. Even the black model doesn't get a lot of smudging at all, and so I really like this overall finish. But if you are concerned about smudging of any kind, then I think the 16-bit model might be a better fit for you. And over the past week or so of testing these 2 color options, I have been a little bit torn. I like that the 16-bit model has a little bit more of a game console and retro feel to it. But when all is said and done, between these 2 models, I'm going to use the black model as my primary Retroid Pocket 5. I really love having these deep blacks that just blend right into the rest of the device. And even though it's not a perfect blend, and it does have a little bit more smudging, it's something that I'm willing to live with. Now, I mentioned in my impressions video, and I wanted to mention it again, this is a pre-release unit. I think the hardware itself is a final build, but the software is still being worked on. And this is something that the company put out even before they shipped out the review units, that they still were working on the Android 13 build. And so even though I am considering this to be a review, there are a few things that I would consider to be non-reviewable right now. And I went back and forth about this, but I don't think that any of them are deal breakers, and I want to explain why. To start, let's talk about the 5 software issues that they're currently working on. The first is that the sleep mode within Android is not working very well. And this is definitely something that I can confirm. Usually when putting the device to sleep within Android, overnight you'll lose about 50% charge, and that is totally unacceptable. Now, this device can dual boot Linux, and I've been testing that as well. And I found that when in sleep mode overnight, I only lost about 4% battery. So I don't think it's a hardware thing. Again, it has to do with that Android 13 build that they're still working on. The second is that audio does not go through video out. So when you plug it into a dock or via HDMI, it's still going to play the audio through the speakers and not the thing that you're plugging it into. And I also tested this device docked, and I found that exact thing to be true. Now, of note, the docked experience is actually pretty great. So I was using the official Retroid dock that I bought when I bought the Retroid Pocket Mini last month. I think it's $30, and it has 4 different USB hookups as well as HDMI and Ethernet. And in my testing, other than the audio thing, I found the docked experience to be very good. To start, it does charge as well as give you video out at the same time using the dock. And in addition, once you've hooked it up with a Bluetooth controller, it's a fairly seamless experience depending on the emulator app that you're using. If you're just going to be using it within RetroArch, so for all those retro systems, it is going to pick up on your Bluetooth controller. You won't have to do any remapping. And so in particular, if you're looking for a dockable or consoleable experience, kind of treating it like a Nintendo Switch, as long as you stay within RetroArch, then you will have a very seamless experience. Same thing with the standalone PSP emulator as well as Android games. These will generally just auto map your controls, and so you can just kind of go back and forth between the two. Other emulators are going to be more complicated, including things like GameCube, Wii, and PS2. Those will require setting up your own profiles. And this has always been an issue with Android. Very few of these app developers think about the fact that the Android device that people will be using with their emulators are also going to be hooked up to a TV. Either way, I did want to comment on the fact that yes, the audio is coming out through the speakers, but everything else when it comes to having a docked experience is very good. Now, the third issue with the software right now is that fast charging is not fully implemented. And also I can confirm that when you plug it in, it takes about an hour, hour and a half to charge from 0 to 100. Now, eventually they are expecting to have a 27 watt fast charge, which means it's going to charge super fast, but at least not right now. The fourth thing is they said that video codecs for game streaming have not been fully optimized. I also did a bunch of testing with game streaming, including cloud and local remote play, and I didn't really find any issues when I was testing it. And so already from a streaming perspective, I at least didn't find any flaws, but it is nice that they are also optimizing it even more. And then finally, the fifth thing here is that they said the Retroid launcher is not fully available just yet. And again, for me, that was not a huge deal because I already use a different front end anyway. This is Emulation Station Desktop Edition. I've done guides and everything about this, but this is the way that I prefer to navigate through my games anyway. And so even though I appreciate that Retroid is working on their own launcher, I kind of like the one that I'm already using. And so putting it all together, yes, there are still some software things that need to be worked out, and Retroid is supposed to have them available in the next week or two, and I didn't think it was worth stopping my review and waiting for those things, especially because I didn't find any of them to be really deal breakers. And Retroid has a good track record of finding software bugs like this and then fixing them with over-the-air updates, and so I think it is something that will be fixed. However, there is always risk when it comes to a pre-order, and so if any of these things are deal breakers for you, then it might be worth just waiting until we actually get that over-the-air update. Either way, for the rest of the review, we're going to focus on all the things that we can test, and most of these are hardware related. And because we already talked about battery drain when it comes to sleep, let's actually just talk about battery performance. And because this device can dual boot both Android and Linux, I decided to test both of them for the emulators that were available. And I tend to use very high-tech methods, either just playing the game itself or affixing a rubber band to it to make sure that things stay in motion. Either way, let's talk about my testing suite and the results that I got from it. To start, I played everything at 50% brightness and 50% volume. I also tested everything in high performance mode, so I wanted to make sure I got the best performance possible, even if it did make some sacrifices when it came to battery life. Let's start with lightweight gaming. I tested Contra 3 Alien Wars. And when it came to lightweight systems, I found that I lost about 9% per hour, both on Linux and Android. And so that means that we'll get a little bit more than 11 hours of gameplay at this setting. And also bear in mind, because I was consistent in using high performance mode on the Android side, you will get more if you turn that off. Either way, for me, anything over like 10 hours when it comes to retro gaming is more than enough. Now, moving up from there, I tested out Jak 3 on PS2, one of the more demanding games on that platform. And this time I did see a disparity in battery life between Android and Linux. On the Linux side, I got 3 hours and 20 minutes of gameplay, but on Android it was actually quite a bit better, 6 hours and 40 minutes. In fact, it was basically double on Android compared to Linux. And for me, anything over like 3 hours in a charge is going to be pretty good when playing something like PS2, so I have no complaints when it comes to the battery life. And then finally, as you can see here, I also tested out some Nintendo Switch gameplay. Now, Linux does not have a Nintendo Switch emulator, but Android does. And here I found it to be a little bit more demanding than PS2. This one ran for 2 hours and 13 minutes. And so the battery life here is not going to be great when really pushing it on things like Nintendo Switch, but you're still going to get over 2 hours. Okay, now that we've talked about battery life, I want to break out the rest of the video into 2 major chunks. We're going to talk about why I think you should consider the Retroid Pocket 5 and why you may want to skip it. I think there are good reasons for each, and so I want to highlight some of the strengths and weaknesses that I've discovered over the past week or so. So let's start with the number one thing that I've really enjoyed about the Retroid Pocket 5, and that's the overall shape and feel of it. We talked about this a lot in my impressions video, but man, this thing is so comfortable, and it's only gotten better over the past week. I love these ergonomic bumps here on the back and the fact that they have a little bit of a gritty texture to them. And the front of this device is just so premium looking because we have that full glass screen. Now, previously Retroid was always known for making, a little bit more retro style devices, but I feel like this is a little bit more modern. And I think it's especially apparent when you talk about the black model because this thing looks so sleek. And so that's one of my favorite things about the Retroid Pocket 5. It just feels a lot more premium than its price point would suggest. A good comparison here is going to be the Odin 2 Mini. This one is $340, so about $120 more than the Retroid Pocket 5. Now, this one is a lot more powerful, and I think it has a wonderful shape to it too. I love the fact that it reminds me of a PS Vita. However, there are some elements to this device that kind of hold it back, including these really smudgy plastics. I'm also not a huge fan of the ergonomics here. I think it's very true to the original PS Vita, but it's just not as comfortable, especially when it comes to playing modern stuff with dual sticks. In addition, this one gets warm to the touch, especially if you're going to be pushing that CPU. Whereas with the Retroid Pocket 5, it does get a little bit warm, but it's usually around here, and I just don't really feel it because there's so much ventilation and cooling. In addition, the Retroid Pocket 5 is AMOLED versus Mini LED on the Odin 2 Mini, and this one has always felt a little bit too washed out, but then also a little bit too much vignetting. And so this is a great comparison example. We've got the Retroid Pocket 5, which is a lot cheaper, but does a lot of things better. The ergonomics, the heat, as well as the screen. It does present a bit of a conundrum because the Odin 2 Mini's chipset can outperform the Retroid Pocket 5 by a mile. And we'll do some comparisons about that later on when we talk about the Odin 2. Either way, I think this is the number one reason why you should consider the Retroid Pocket 5. It's just so premium and nice. The handheld itself is beautifully crafted, but then also it's got a great size and weight to it. It's not quite at the point where I would consider it to be pocketable, but it is ultra compact and portable. You can definitely squeeze it in a pocket, even in your pants, but it's not something I would walk around with. And a lot of that comes down to the ergonomic bumps on the back. It just makes it a little bit too thick for me. However, I think a 5.5-inch screen is just about perfect. That's the same size as the Nintendo Switch Lite. And so I think if you're looking for a mid-size handheld, something that's pretty small compared to a Steam Deck, something that's a little bit more portable, then yes, this is an excellent example. It's the perfect size for a handheld that I can just kind of take around anywhere. I can throw it in a backpack, take it with me on travel, or just lay around in the house, either in bed or on the couch. All of these are really great places to play the Retroid Pocket 5. And so I think that Retroid nailed it when it came to this shape and size. It's super comfortable to use, but then also it's just like that perfect size where I can use it in a bunch of different situations. Now, neck and neck with the shape and size of it is the screen, because this is really exceptional. I talked about it a lot in the impressions video, but it is a very rich and vibrant screen. In addition, it gets super bright, so if you want to play it outdoors, you can, but it also gets super dim, so if you want to play it in the dark, you can as well. And this screen is really something that you have to see to believe, because even right now, when having like perfect color correction and running it in 4K, it's still not really imparting how great the screen is in person. And to be honest, I'm not a huge screen snob. Like, I don't need OLED with every device, but this is one that I can really appreciate. It makes all those colors pop just a little bit more, and I love that contrast between the dark and the light parts too. In other words, no matter what part of the spectrum you are when it comes to screen snobbiness, I think you'll still really enjoy this experience. In addition, I love this 5.5-inch screen. It feels so much bigger than the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, which was 4.7 inches. To put that into perspective, let's compare it against the Retroid Pocket Mini, which came out last month. This one also has an AMOLED display, but it is 3.7 inches. And if we compare 4x3 content on the Retroid Pocket 5 against the Retroid Pocket Mini, there's a big difference. You're going to get about 4.5 inches of screen real estate on the 16:9 display of the Retroid Pocket 5. But the biggest difference comes when playing 16:9 content. Obviously, the Retroid Pocket 5 will be able to play that natively, but the Retroid Pocket Mini will have to shrink that down quite a bit. And so when playing 16:9 content, the Retroid Pocket 5 is obviously going to be 5.5 inches, but the Retroid Pocket Mini is only about 3.4 inches. So we're really looking at something that's about a 2-inch difference between the two. And considering the fact that many of the games that you'll be playing on here are going to be widescreen oriented, or at least have widescreen hacks, then you're going to be able to take up a lot more screen real estate with the Retroid Pocket 5. And the difference between the two is so stark, to the point where I'm not really sure how much I'm going to be playing the Retroid Pocket Mini, given the fact that I have a Retroid Pocket 5 to use. And there are a lot of little practical things that make a big difference when using these two devices. For example, when navigating through a menu, the text is going to be quite a bit bigger. Even something as simple as just typing on the on-screen keyboard is a lot easier with the Retroid Pocket 5, when it's kind of a chore with the Retroid Pocket Mini. And so it does feel like the Retroid Pocket 5 is a bit of a Goldilocks device, in that it has a really nice size and weight to it, but then also a nice big screen compared to the size of the device. Now, the third reason why I think you should consider the Retroid Pocket 5 has to do with its versatility from a software and hardware perspective. To start, this is designed to be an Android-based device, so it's going to run Android 13, and that means you'll be able to play all sorts of Android games. Basically anything that you can get from the Play Store will be able to play on this device. So before we even talk about emulation, there's an entire ecosystem of gaming that you can do. Same thing when it comes to streaming, like I mentioned before. So you could stream this from the cloud or from your local Xbox or PS5 or even your PC. All those are going to work really well, and we've got Android apps for all of that. However, one of the unique things of the Retroid Pocket 5 is that it uses that Snapdragon 865, which will allow it to dual boot into Linux. So I didn't experiment with the black Retroid Pocket 5 when it arrived, because I was trying to play just with one single SD card both on Android and Linux. And to be honest, I almost pulled it off, and I think it will be a viable solution sometime in the future. So let me walk you through the process. We're going to start on the Android side, and you can see here that I can go into Emulation Station Desktop Edition and I can boot up my games. But the interesting thing here is that I'm loading up these games from the Linux-based operating system's partition. This partition is formatted into ext4, which is usually going to be Linux-based, but Android is also Linux-based, so it can read it. Now, there are some limitations here. For example, only RetroArch was able to actually find and use this folder. The other standalone emulators had some permission problems. Either way, as a proof of concept, you can see that at least I am using that Linux partition to load these games. Now, let's say that I wanted to jump into Linux, so this is going to be pretty easy. You have to restart the device, and as soon as it does, you press the volume up button, which will load up the bootloader. From there, you can choose to boot into Linux, and we're going to load up that operating system, which is called Rocknix. And I already did a video showcasing this operating system on the Retroid Pocket Mini. I'll leave a link down below. But long story short, I'm now in Linux, but then also accessing all those same games as before. And again, it's not a perfect solution. I had to do all sorts of permission changes on the Linux side, and then I also had to use a special XML file that I got from a community member named Jade who helped me out with that. Either way, it was a pretty interesting proof of concept that I could just use the same SD card instead of having to swap between the two. Now, the reason why this is so important to me is because there are certain things you can play on Linux that you can't on Android and vice versa. On the Linux side, we've got quite a few things like native Pico 8 as well as an Xbox emulator, and then also we can play native PC ports. And I loaded all these up using a tool called Portmaster, which I've made videos about before as well. And so that's the great thing about this whole Linux side, is that I can play games that you wouldn't be able to access on Android. For example, there's now a port of UFO 50, so I can play this PC game directly on this device, and I think it's a perfect fit. In addition, there are a ton of lightweight PC games that have been ported over with Portmaster, which are an excellent fit for this device as well. And so this is definitely one of my favorite reasons to use Rocknix, because I can play these PC games. There are nearly 700 of them on Portmaster. Something else that we can play on Linux and not on Android is native Pico 8. So this is going to allow me to navigate through the Pico 8 Explore menu to download my games and play them directly on the device. There are some workarounds where you can play this on Android basically by using a Windows container, but it's a lot easier to set up on Linux, and so this is another reason why I like having Rocknix on my device as well. Another emulator that works great on Linux and isn't available on Android is Sega Model 3. There's a bunch of mid to late 90s arcade games that will play with this emulator, and some of these are really fun. Now, admittedly, it's not a perfect experience because some of these controls have not been configured properly. For example, with the Star Wars arcade game, this is mapped all over the place. I think right is up and left is down. It's really confusing. Same thing with Jurassic Park Lost World. This one doesn't have a reticle, so it's really hard to see where you're actually aiming until you actually fire. Regardless, I think it's still super cool that we can even play these games on this device, and so this is a big win for me. In addition, like I showed in my Retroid Pocket Mini review, you can play Xbox games on this device as well. And the Rocknix team has actually made a bunch of improvements even over the past few weeks since that last video. For example, you can overclock the GPU on the device, but then also you can upclock the CPU on the Xbox hardware as well. And so even though most of these games are still going to be unplayably slow, at least in my book, it does make them perform a lot better. For example, with Soul Calibur 2, this one was playing I think at like 15 frames per second previously, and now it's playing around 45 or 50. Same thing with Dead or Alive 2, I think this was playing at just maybe 10 or 20% speed, but now it's at least at 50% speed. And the biggest surprise for me was that Halo Combat Evolved was almost playable. It's actually pretty good, almost at full speed when you're walking around, but when you're in the heat of the battle, it does bog down quite a bit. And I'm not sure if we're going to be able to get improved performance beyond this, but it's still really cool to see that it's better than it was. Just bear in mind that this emulator in particular is still kind of a work in progress, so many games are going to be all sorts of messed up. And so I think it'll be some time before Xbox emulation is a universal thing, but I still think it's really cool to test out if you're up for it. Now, when it comes to more bread and butter systems, these are going to play great even on the Linux side. For example, with GameCube, I'm playing this at a 3x resolution and it's playing great. I was also surprised to find that some games played better on Linux than they did on Android. A really weird example here is going to be Jak 3 on PS2. This I'm playing at a 2.5x resolution and I'm using the Vulkan backend. And the thing is, the Linux Vulkan drivers are actually pretty updated, and so it's running really smoothly. By contrast, on the Android side, I found that Jak 3 was one of the hardest to perform games on this platform. The Vulkan backend was very slow, but then also had a bunch of graphical anomalies. And these can be fixed, but you have to go pretty deep into the settings to make those adjustments. I found that the easiest way to get this game at least up and running with a 2.5x resolution was to use OpenGL as the backend, and then to add a mild underclock. And even then, this gameplay was not quite as smooth as it was on the Linux side, so it's great to have two options in case you don't want to dive too deep into the settings. But just bear in mind, this is not a universal truth. For example, there are some games that play worse on Linux compared to Android. A good example here is going to be Area 51. This game bogged down quite a bit and had all sorts of graphical anomalies on Linux. Meanwhile, on the Android side, the performance was quite a bit better. Now, 2.5x resolution was a little bit much for this game, but 2x resolution played pretty smoothly. And so I kind of look at this in one of two different ways. Number one, it is a bit of a pain to have to jump between Linux and Android to play certain PS2 games. But it's also pretty neat that we have the option in the first place, because if we only had Android or if we only had Linux, we would just be stuck in that ecosystem. So long story short, this is my third reason why I think that you should consider the Retroid Pocket 5 because of its versatility. You're going to be able to play Android games and streaming and emulators, but then also on the Linux side, you can play all of those emulators as well. Okay, now let's talk about the fourth and final reason why I think you should consider the Retroid Pocket 5. And this will all really come down to performance and whether or not the max that this device can handle is going to be good enough for you. Now, of course, when it comes to retro systems, all these games are going to play great. Like I mentioned before, having an OLED display is amazing, and then also playing these games on the black model is also a really great experience. I love the fact that these black bars on the left and right just kind of disappear into the rest of the shell. It's a similar story with wider systems like Game Boy Advance. You're still going to have black bars on the left and right, but depending on the color model that you have for your Retroid Pocket 5, it's not really that big of a deal. And again, because we have that bezel-less display, even when playing on like this 16-bit model like this, these black bars are not that intrusive. And so I find myself, even when playing 4x3 content with the 16-bit model, still really marveling at this overall screen experience. Now, when we start to move up to things like Dreamcast and Nintendo 64, a lot of these do have widescreen hacks or cheats. And so if you are looking to play widescreen versions of some of your favorite classic games, and then, obviously upscale them to 1080p as well, the Retroid Pocket 5 can handle that no problem. In addition, this system can play Sega Saturn no problem, even using the most accurate emulators. I also found this this device to be a perfect PSP experience. It's got a 1080p display, which means that you can play them at a 4x upscale. And then of course the 5.5-inch OLED display just makes everything pop even more. I've always found the Retroid products to be some of the best ways to play PSP, and the Retroid Pocket 5 is definitely the best among those. Now when it comes to GameCube emulation, I would characterize this as being effortless. By that I mean that you can essentially just turn this on a 3x resolution upscale and basically every game that you play is going to play great. It's one of those things where you're going to have to try pretty hard to find games that aren't going to play at full speed. It's a similar story with Nintendo Wii, but a little bit more demanding. At the very least, there may be some games that have slowdown into 3x resolution and you'll have to drop them down to a 2x or heaven forbid back to just the native resolution. Either way, I think if you are looking performance-wise to play things like GameCube and Wii, this is going to be able to handle it no problem. It's a similar story with PlayStation 2 up to a certain point. This one definitely can hit a ceiling. To start, I want to mention that there are a lot of widescreen patches available for PS2 games. And so for the most part, you can just set these games to be at 16:9, turn on the widescreen patches, and just about every game is going to play like that. But like I mentioned, there is going to be a ceiling when it comes to emulation performance with PS2. And strangely, there seems to be no rhyme or reason, because some games that I would expect to play just fine actually struggled. And along those same lines, games that I expected to be a little bit harder to run actually played really well. Let's use Ratchet & Clank as an example. This one is among the 3 Ratchet & Clank games usually the easiest one to play. And I tested all 3 of these games, and the second and third game actually play really well. But surprisingly, it's the first Ratchet & Clank game that actually struggled. For this one, I had to turn it down to a 2x resolution instead of 2.5x like I was testing for most of the other games. And even then, I saw quite a bit of slowdown here and there just in that first and second level. And this was surprising for me, especially considering the fact that the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, which is the previous model, this one can play this game at a 2.5x resolution with no hint of slowdown. The biggest takeaway that I had here is that I would not expect every single PS2 game to play well, and so if you are looking to play most of the catalog, this will be great, but if you're looking to play all of the catalog, you may have to look elsewhere. Let's go back to the Jack 3 example. So like I mentioned before, this one can play at a 2.5x resolution, but you will have to turn on underclocking, which does make the game feel not quite as smooth. Now thankfully, because it does dual boot into Linux, we have another option there, and also it's pretty great that it does play at full speed. But let's compare it against the Odin 2, which is my favorite Android-based handheld. This one can play that same game, but at a 5x resolution, which is a 4K resolution, way beyond what this screen can handle. But this is one of the reasons why I like the Odin 2 so much, is because it has so much power. In fact, I'm not even turning on the high performance mode here, I'm just keeping it at the standard low performance mode. Here's another example with Okage. This game has a lot of slowdown in the main village. Again, I'm trying to run this at a 2.5x resolution. I did all sorts of emulation hacks as well in order to get this screen to look proper. But as you can see, there's quite a bit of slowdown as I run back and forth between these shops. Even if I drop it down to a native resolution, it is still slowing down. Now the slowdown is not constant and it's not that terrible, like I would still probably play through this game, but if you're looking for a pitch perfect experience of Okage, this is not it. Meanwhile, with the Odin 2 again, with the standard performance mode, I am getting a 5x resolution, no problem whatsoever. So I could play this game in 4K, plug it into a TV, and have a great experience. So long story short, I did find that PS2 emulation over the past week or so has been somewhat inconsistent, and if that is a deal breaker for you, that is something to consider. However, there are still some other systems I wanted to test out, so let's move on to those. We're going to start with Nintendo 3DS. Now for all these Nintendo systems going forward, I'm not going to show any actual Nintendo IP. Instead, I'm going to show third-party games that are running on this hardware. And when it comes to 3DS emulation, it is actually pretty decent. I can play just about everything at a 3x resolution, no problem. And because we have a widescreen display, that means I can make the main screen a little bit bigger than the other screen, and I think this is a pretty good fit. That way, if I ever need to see that bottom screen, it's there on the right, but I'm still getting a pretty big display on the left as well. So I think all things considered, the best way to play 3DS games is actually on a 3DS, but the emulation here is not half bad. Next up, let's talk about Wii U. And so when it comes to 2D games, these play absolutely fine, no problem whatsoever. So a game like DuckTales Remastered or something along these lines, yeah, it's going to play great. Now this is still a work in progress app, and so I'm not expecting full emulation performance, and you will see some bugs here or there. For example, with Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transformed, this one does not play at full speed, but then also has a lot of graphical glitches on the track. The major rule of thumb that I found with Wii U emulation in particular is that 3D based games, those that have a 3D engine, just aren't going to play at full speed. So if you are thinking of playing Wii U games on the Retroid Pocket 5, I think you should ask yourself whether or not the games that you want to play are in 2D or 3D. Now, when it comes to this mysterious green person game right here, I'm not going to show any of the actual footage, but I did want to talk about the performance. For this, I used a graphic pack to drop the resolution down to 720p to improve the performance. And I found that here, for the most part, the game would play really well. There were some moments, especially when shaders were caching, where you would see quite a bit of slowdown. In addition, when in the middle of a fight, it would bog down a little bit as well. Neither of these I found to be a deal breaker, at least in the first 30 or 40 minutes that I played this game. So at least when it comes to my own standard, I would definitely play this game on this system. And then finally, let's talk about some third-party Switch games, again, only for testing purposes. And as expected here, lightweight 2D games are going to play just fine. Now I am playing this in handheld mode, which means that we're not going to get a full 1080p experience with many of these games, but I still think that because we have that AMOLED display, it looks very good. This is essentially going to be the size of a Nintendo Switch Lite, but with AMOLED. I think about the upper limit that you can expect when playing Nintendo Switch games on the Retroid Pocket 5 is going to come down to basically role-playing games. Something like Sea of Stars does seem to play at full speed, and I think this is going to be a great experience. Now, much like with Wii U, once you start getting into 3D based engines, then things do start to slow down. For example, Risk of Rain 2 does play less than 60 frames per second. It's still pretty playable. In fact, this was a pretty good time. But as you can imagine, other 3D based games are going to have similar problems, so I would stick to lightweight and 2D games. And even then, it won't be a perfect experience. For example, with Octopath Traveler 2, this one I tried a bunch of different settings and graphical drivers and never really found anything that worked. So in other words, I would say the Nintendo Switch emulation is not something worth buying the Retroid Pocket 5 for. Okay, so those are the 4 reasons why I think you should consider the Retroid Pocket 5. The overall shape and feel, the screen, the fact that it dual boots and all the versatility that comes with it, and then finally the performance up to a certain limit. And even though it does definitely have some ceilings, I think that for a $220 device, that ceiling is pretty high. So now let's talk about some of the reasons why you may want to avoid the Retroid Pocket 5. Some of these I touched upon in my impressions video, but now that I've had a week with it, I've got a little bit more of a solid foundation. The first has to do with the analog stick being down below the D-pad. Now in a lot of retro consoles, I prefer the D-pad to be up top, but I don't really consider this to be a retro console. In fact, the majority of the games that I'll be playing on this will have a predominant analog stick input. And that'll include everything from game streaming to Android games, to even more modern games like Dreamcast, Nintendo 64, and of course GameCube, PS2, and lightweight Nintendo Switch. And in all of those situations, I would prefer to have the analog stick up top. I think it would just be a little bit more comfortable. Now, of course, that's a very divisive opinion, and so if you are team analog stick down below the D-pad, then this will be just fine for you. However, the other thing to consider is the placement of the analog stick itself. Like I mentioned in my impressions video, I wish it was more inboard, and that's because there's just a lot of extra space right here. If we look at the Retroid Pocket 4, this one is more inboard, and that actually makes it a lot more comfortable to use in that one regard because you don't actually press against the analog sticks. Everything is nice and clear. However, with the Retroid Pocket 5, I have definitely felt that my hands touch against these analog sticks as I'm playing with the D-pad and face buttons. Personally, it doesn't really get in the way of me enjoying these games, but if this is something that'll bother you, then it'll definitely bother you on this device. Now there is a workaround for it. You can just pull off the analog stick cap. It just comes right out. And then of course, yes, you can play it like this and you're not going to touch anything down below. But I don't like the idea of having to keep track of these little analog stick caps. I feel like they're going to get lost. And I also don't like the idea of having to come up with a workaround for a bad design. And so personally, I think I would enjoy the Retroid Pocket 5 more if the analog stick was up top and these bottom controls were more inboard. Now, unfortunately, I'm not even sure if it's feasible because I assume there's also a hidden bezel on the left and that's why they couldn't go more inboard. But regardless of the reason for it, I think it is one of the reasons why you may want to consider skipping this device if that's not going to be a good fit for you. Another thing that's not quite perfect on this device are these face buttons. It really comes down to the fact that they're just a little bit louder than I would like. They kind of have a bit of a hollow feel. They're not as bad as the Retroid Pocket Mini, but they are still quite loud. Let's compare it to the sound of the Odin 2 Mini face buttons, which I think are probably best in class. And these are much lighter to the touch and have less travel to them and are a lot quieter as well. And so that's another thing to consider, is that these face buttons are quite loud, and so this might be a deal breaker and a reason to avoid it if you want really quiet buttons. And then finally, another thing to consider about the Retroid Pocket 5 is that performance ceiling. It's one of those things where this device is so good that I wish it played everything, that I could replace all my other devices with this one. Because we have a 5.5-inch screen and it's OLED, I really would love to consider this to be a Nintendo Switch Lite OLED that can play all those games. But unfortunately, when it comes to those higher end systems, this chipset does hold it back. Let's use Hades on Nintendo Switch as our example. So I'm playing this in handheld mode, and I'm playing in high performance mode, and the Retroid Pocket 5 just cannot keep up. Unfortunately, this is kind of a stuttery mess, and so it's not something that I would actually want to play on the Retroid Pocket 5. Meanwhile, on the Odin 2, I'm playing it in docked mode and in just the standard performance mode, so not even high performance mode, and it's playing absolutely fine. And so when it comes down to it, I love the Retroid Pocket 5 design and feel so much that I wish it could replace my Odin 2. But there are quite a few systems that I think are just going to be relegated to my Odin 2, including Nintendo Switch and Wii U, and honestly a lot of the high-end PS2 games as well. It's a weird situation, but I feel like the Retroid Pocket 5 is everything that I wanted in the Odin 2 Mini minus the performance. If we had the same CPU from the Odin 2 Mini, which is the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, but in the Retroid Pocket 5, I think I would just be done. And so I find the Retroid Pocket 5 to be in a bit of a no man's land, in that it is amazing for the things it can do, but it is so good that it makes me wish that it did more. And again, I don't think this is a deal breaker. It's really going to come down to you and the type of gaming that you expect to play. If you're really looking to play, GameCube, Wii, and PS2, this will mostly check all of those boxes. Okay, now that we've gone through all of the reasons why you should consider and avoid the Retroid Pocket 5, let's start wrapping up and talk about what I like and what I dislike and just kind of summarizing it all together. And a lot of these we already went over in the video, but I just wanted to put them all in one sheet. We'll start with what I like, and it's obviously going to be that screen as well as the overall fit and feel of the handheld. When you combine that with the premium design and that compact form factor, it is really just a joy to hold. I also love that we have multiple software options, and I think these are just going to improve in time, especially on the Linux side, because this is the first real powerful Linux handheld that we've had to date. I also think that the cooling on this device is worth noting, because there was never a time over the past week where I felt the device get too hot. And so even when pushing it, I think it is an overall cool experience, and I think that is pretty great. Now, when it comes to things I don't like, I think this is all really predictable. I think the analog stick experience is not the best. And this has to do with the fact that I think the analog stick should be up top with this device, but then also the placement of them is not the best. When trying to play a twin stick game, you can really feel that difference. It just is not as ergonomic as I would like. I also think that the face buttons here are very good, but imperfect. If they were a little bit more rounded, or maybe didn't stick out so much from the shell, I think I would like them more. And then finally, I think that you will find that some of the high-end performance with this device is somewhat inconsistent. I definitely expected that when it came to Nintendo Switch and Wii U emulation, but I was surprised to see how hit and miss some PS2 games were. It definitely is one of those things where you kind of have to hunt to find the defects, but when you find them, it is a little bit alarming. So putting this all together, we're going to go right back to that first question of the video, which is, what is the Retroid Pocket 5? And the way I see it, this is a gorgeous, well-built handheld that has a ton of versatility for its price. And it is certainly the best handheld that you can get right now under $250. However, due to some of those performance limitations, I don't consider this to be an endgame device for everybody. If you are looking to play just most GameCube and Wii and PS2 games, then yes, it can definitely do that, and of course everything below that. And I also think that it is a worthy upgrade from the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro. The performance is better on the Retroid Pocket 5, but it's not a huge leap. Instead, it's all about that form factor and screen. And if those are important to you, then yes, I think it is worth upgrading. In the end, I was hoping that the Retroid Pocket 5 would replace my Odin 2 as being like my primary handheld when it came to the Android platform, especially considering the fact that this has an AMOLED display, and honestly 5.5 inches is very close to 6 anyway. But when it comes down to it, performance is a big factor for me, and I want to be able to play every single PS2 game no problem, and I also want to play most Switch and Wii U games as well. And as it stands, the Odin 2 right now is that best balance between the performance as well as the form factor and size. And honestly, it's not that much more expensive than the Retroid Pocket 5 when it comes down to it. You can get the base model of the Odin 2 for $299. So in wrapping this all up, if you are looking for the best handheld that you can find for under $250, that is the Retroid Pocket 5. And it is a handheld that I can heartily recommend because I think a lot of people are going to love it. However, if you are already going to be spending that much money and performance is a big factor for you, then I think that you should consider the Odin 2. For me personally, I love the Retroid Pocket 5 and I cannot wait to see a better chip in a similar form factor because that may finally be that endgame device for me. For now, I'm just going to keep playing my Odin 2 until that perfect alternative appears. Anyway, that's it for this video. What do you think about the Retroid Pocket 5? Did you pre-order one? Are you excited? What color did you order? I'd love to hear about that as well. Anyway, as always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.